In early September 1939, British Movie Time News informed an anxious nation all over the country that Britain was once again at war.
The fateful hour of 11 has struck, and Britain's final warning to Hitler having been ignored, a state of war once more exists between Great Britain and Germany.
Unlike other European countries, Britain had always relied on volunteers to fight in times of war. Conscription had been introduced in 1916 when more men were needed to fight in the trenches, but it was abandoned when the war ended. During the 1930s, some men still chose to enter the armed forces after leaving school, and in 1937 there were 200,000 soldiers in the British Army. The government knew that this was not enough to fight the war with Germany, and in April 1939 introduced the Military Training Act. The terms of the act meant that all men between the ages of 20 and 21 had to register for 6 months military training. At the same time, a list of reserved occupations was published. The list occupations were essential to the war effort and stated that those employed in those jobs were exempt for conscription.
The government saw that keeping morale up on the home front would be key to winning the war. People on the home front played a big part in the production of the equipment for the war, so it was vital to maintain both the morale and the faith that the war would be won. One method of maintaining public morale was the organization of the local war effort campaigns. These gave people the opportunity to play a part in the war effort by contributing in any way they could. Propaganda was a tool used by both sides in the war in order to boost morale or to have the enemy's morale lowered. On occasions, papers such as the German propaganda leaflets were dropped by the enemy in an effort to lessen public support for the war. The government also used propaganda posters to bolster the public support for the war. The government used censorship to control newspapers and other forms of the media. This way, they made sure that the reports would only report on the positive things about the war, by highlighting the heroism of the soldiers and rescuers, instead of reporting about the injuries and deaths of the soldiers. Men thought this was extremely important as it kept morale high.
Started. Britain imported about 55 million tons of food a year from other countries. After war was declared in September 1939, the British government had to cut down on the amount of food it brought from abroad as enemy ships targeted incoming Allied merchant vessels, preventing vital supplies including fruit, sugar, cereals, and meat from reaching the UK. Because of this, and to ensure fair distribution of supplies, the Ministry of Food issued ration books to every person, and families had to register at one shop. There was a worry that this would lead to shortages of food supplies in the shops, so the British government decided to introduce a system of rationing. Rationing made sure that people got an equal amount of food every week. The government was worried that as food became scarcer, prices would rise and poor people might not be able to afford to eat. Less than a third of the food available in Britain at the start of the war was produced at home. Official rationing began on the 8th of January 1940 with bacon, butter, and sugar. Rations were distributed by weight, monetary value, or points. One person's typical weekly allowance would be 1 fresh egg, 4 ounce margarine and bacon, 2 ounce butter and 1 ounce cheese, and 8 ounce sugar. Meat was allocated by price, so cheaper cuts became popular. Points could be pooled or saved to buy pulses, cereals, tinned goods, dried fruit, biscuits, and jam. By 1940, wasting food was a criminal offense. As sugar was in short supply, sweets were rationed from July 1942 to February 1953. An attempt to de-ration them in 1949 lasted just 4 months as demand far outstripped supply. Despite the stresses of wartime, the health of the poor improved. People were encouraged to eat protein, carbohydrates, pulses, and fruit and vegetables. Babies, pregnant women, and the sick were allocated additional nutrients such as milk, orange juice, and cod liver oil.
Everyone was asked to help win the war by making extra efforts and working harder on the home front. Women played an important part in the Second World War. With many men away fighting it, the roles were left to the women to step up and take them on. Women worked in factories, farmed the land, and even joined the forces. Without a doubt, women played a vital role in war. Children saved pennies, collected scrap metal, and wasted food. They knitted woolen hats for soldiers and refugees. So, with many men away in the forces, millions of women worked in factories, on buses and trains, in hospitals and schools. Around 80,000 women joined the Women's Land Army to work on farms. By 1942, 400,000 British women were serving in the Army, Navy, and Air Forces. Women pilots flew planes from factories to RAF bases. The Women's Land Army, which had been vital during the First World War, was reformed in 1939. This was a means of providing labour to the farms, as men that had worked on the farms were now away at war and the country needed to increase the food production to get through the war. Their contribution to the war effort was incredibly important, as it made sure that the people of Britain did not starve during the war. The Women's Voluntary Service, also known as the WVS, did many jobs. During the London Blitz, they provided refreshments for the firefighters during the clear-up. Many members of the WVS stepped after people whose homes had been lost due to the German bombings. For these people, the support that they received was valuable and immeasurable. Women also knitted items for servicemen, with some going as far as adopting a sailor to provide with warm clothes they knitted. By 1943, the women's service had reached 1 million members. Most were elderly, as many younger women were either forced into factories, working on farms, or part of the Women's Land Army.
Within 3 weeks, the first groups of British children were on their way overseas, 1,500 of them bound for Canada. These were children whose homes lay in specially dangerous zones, children from the industrial north, from the naval bases of Dover and Portsmouth, from the dock areas of London. And then the great adventure began.
Evacuation was officially announced on August 31st and began on September 1st, 2 days before the declaration of war. From London to other main cities, people in the priority class boarded trains and were dispatched to rural towns and villages in the designated areas. They were also sent by bus to closer areas. With the uncertainties over registering for evacuation, the actual movement was also disjointed. Evacuees were gathered into groups and put on the first available train, regardless of its destination. School and family groups were further separated in the transfer from mainline trains to more local transport. Almost 3.75 million people were displaced, with around a third of the entire population experiencing some effects of the evacuation. In the first 3 days of official evacuation, 1.5 million people were moved, 827,000 children of school age, 524,000 mothers and young children, and 13,000 pregnant women were displaced. While these numbers seemed high, some people were reluctant to move, and only 47% of the school children, about 1/3 of the mothers, actually went to their designated areas. Hosts were often put into inconvenience, especially by many children who seemed to be vulnerable to stress symptoms, such as enuris and other. A further 2 million or so were more wealthy individuals evacuated privately, some settling in hotels for the duration, and several thousand traveling to Canada, the United States, South Africa, and Australia. Goods as well as people were evacuated. Art treasures were sent to the distinct storage, and the National Gallery collection spent the war near North Wales. The Bank of England moved to a small town of Overton, Hampshire in 1939, and 1940 moved 2,154 tons of gold into the vaults of Bank of Canada in Ottawa.
Preceded by a shower of flares, German bombers rained fire and high explosive bombs in their most savage attack on London. Here again is the blood, the sweat and tears that Nazi warfare brings to the men, women and children of city, town and village. Here again are the same firefighters who face peril and danger with the same grim determination and courage. Amid the rain of bombs and falling masonry, they fight the hell of Hitler's making, while our cameramen record for all time their stupendous task. Caught by blast like some foul giant's breath, and blistered by the intense heat, London's firemen carry on. Here are heroes in action.
Every so often, Londoners' landscape becomes drastically transformed, and it's not always of the Londoners' choosing. Just like the Great Fire nearly 300 years before, the Blitz during World War II totally decimated parts of the capital. This time, however, it was no accident. By September 1940, London had already experienced German bombing, but the Blitz started in earnest in the afternoon of September 7th, when the German Luftwaffe filled the skies in the first major daytime raid on London. Nearly 350 German bombers dropped explosives on East London, targeting the docks in particular. Around 450 people died and 1,300 were seriously injured. The nighttime raids that followed were just as terrible and deadly. Night after night for nearly 2 months, the bombers returned. The Strand, the West End, and Piccadilly were attacked. St. Thomas's Hospital, St. Paul's Cathedral, Buckingham Palace, Lambeth Palace, and the House of Commons were all hit. Between September and November, almost 30,000 bombs were dropped on London. In the first 30 days, almost 6,000 people were killed and twice as many badly injured.
In the run-up to the war, a civil defense network was established, but the threat of bombing had not been fully appreciated until reports from the Spanish Civil War started to be published. When the war was declared in 1939 September, various civil defense organizations received numerous volunteers, most of which were civilian air raid police, also known as the ARP, or as they more commonly known as, the Air Raid Warners. Among the duties of the ARP was to enforce a blackout, which was intended to prevent street lights from windows, etc., from providing German night bombers with visual night aids.
Around the Thames estuary and along the Medway, lights have gone out and the first large-scale rehearsals of air raid precautions are staged in England. Grotesquely clad wardens and ambulance men dash to and fro, giving help and guidance and rescuing mock casualties. When a year ago, British Movietone News, through its editor, urged the necessity of educating the civilian population to operations of this kind, it was like a voice crying in the wilderness. Now it has come to pass.
The lengths that people went to complete blackout their home was another regular activity, and one that brought the civilian population into war. Those who transgressed would hear the warner's words, "Put that light out," and repeated offenders would find themselves in front of the local magistrates. As a first response to the threat of bombing in the late summer of 1939, trenches were dug around schools and factories for children and workers to take cover during the confidently expected air raids. As the phony war lengthened into the summer and winter, however, proper air raid shelters were issued to the population to supplement the public, and institutional shelters were replacing the trenches as places of the shelters around the country.